Okay, welcome everyone. Good evening to all of you, and welcome to the Agrarian Change seminar for today. The Agrarian Change seminars, as you all know, is organized by the Journal of Agrarian Change and SOAS Department of Development Studies. I'm Shreya Sinha. I'm one of the editors of the journal, and also I'm based at Queen Mary, University of London. Today's seminar is by Jens Lerche, who needs really no introduction here. But his talk is called Caste from Field to Factory, 100 Years of Accumulation, Exploitation and Caste Oppression in Rural Uttar Pradesh, India. So I know he needs no introduction, but I'm still going to go ahead and introduce him anyway. Jens is Professor in Agrarian and Labor Studies at SOAS Development Studies. He works on agrarian relations, labor relations, caste and racial discrimination and oppression. His research focuses on India, where a main concern of his is Dalit class caste oppression and work relations, including seasonal labor migration. He's also, of course, been an editor of the journal for a very long time now. His publications include the book Ground Down by Growth, Tribe, Caste, Class and Inequality in 21st Century India. And he has published very widely in Journal of Peasant Studies, Development Change, Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers. I can go on for a while, but without, I think that's Jens, and he's going to present his work over, I suppose, several years to us today. Just before we start, as always, this lecture will be recorded. So especially for people online, if you don't want to be recorded, please keep your audio and video off. And I suppose here your audio will be recorded if you are asking a question because you don't have a chat option. But yeah, so if you don't want to come up, that's fine as well, and you can be recorded. Okay, so without further ado, Jens, you have 15 minutes to uncover.
Thanks so much, Freya. It's really great to have you introducing me.
Yes.
For this seminar. Yes. Freya, I had the pleasure of supervising Freya's PhD, so it's like seeing the next generation coming through, which is always great. I will share screen and get going. That should be going now. Okay. I should start maybe by saying a few words about why I do this presentation. Because in a sense, my topic is not new. Many people work on similar issues, and there's a lot of literature relating to agrarian change in India, accumulation, also caste relations, and so on. What I wanted to do was I wanted, of course, to contribute to that literature. And I wanted to do that because I've now visited a couple of villages in Uttar Pradesh, North India, on and off over 25 years. And I thought, and as part of that, I focused on how caste and class relations are two sides of the same coin. And I thought that the qualitative insights over time, with that particular focus, there's still something to add to the literature based on that. So that is sort of my modest hope, to be able to say something that is of interest for people that work in the field and beyond based on that. There we are. So what I'll do here is sort of the slightly grandiose title, so it indicates that I'll take a historical perspective here, and I will of course do that. But it's also obvious when I got an hour to present at most, there's quite a limit to what I can do by way of history. So what I'll do is I will really do a couple of points from a couple of historical points and then I will go on to what is the main aspect of the presentation, which is really with a focus on the two villages in North India from my first fieldwork in '92 onwards. So really during the neoliberal period there, and the focus I will have is I will focus on the non-agricultural accumulation of castes of rural capital and petty commodity producers. That is one of the focuses. Another one is what has happened with the laboring Dalit castes in the same period, partly linked to these changes that have happened in accumulation of the landed caste, but partly also beyond that. I will, as part of it, and the way I'll do it is that I'll follow in the footsteps of the work that I've done with Al-Bashar before, in the sense that I will look at caste and class as co-constituted, and sort of we have used the term coined by the anthropologist Philippe Bourgois of conjugated oppression to indicate that we see it as a fact that globally social oppression and exploitation do take place along the lines of caste, tribe, race, ethnicity, gender, and class, and they are all inextricably linked as different sides of the same coin. And in that sense, and then it's that conjugated oppression that divides the laboring classes and serves the interest of capital at the same time. So that's the perspective I will take on this. And I will do that by looking at accumulation as caste specific and as the patterns of exploitation and oppression along the same lines. I will also therefore look at the change in caste oppression over time in a global perspective. And I will argue that as far as I can see, what's going on here is really a normalizing of capitalist labor discrimination in India away from its base, which is partial base in Indian purity, pollution principles, etc. So it is changing into something that is more common within global capitalism. One could say it's becoming a secularized evil. So that is the intention. Before I start, let us just get clear where we are. We are in Uttar Pradesh, the most populous state in India, in North India. We are looking at two villages, one in West UP, Muzaffarnagar, one in the district of Jaunpur in East UP. Now, West UP is normally expected to be said to be much more agriculturally developed, and the driving landed caste there is the Jat caste, and whereas in East UP, East UP was for long said to be semi-feudal, and certainly the landed castes are old landlord groups, including the Thakurs or the Rajput caste, and in Jaunpur that is the case as well. So what I've looked at here is a village where the Jats dominate in West UP, the Thakurs dominate in East UP, and I've looked at relations to the Dalit laboring caste. Now, the Dalits constitute 16.8% of the Indian population, and it is the ex-untouchable caste that activists among themselves have used the term Dalits for themselves. Among Dalits in UP, the main Dalit caste is the Jatas, that constitute around 50% of the Dalits in UP. So I'm drawing on this. I'm also drawing on other work I've been involved in. I've already mentioned my co-work with Al-Bashar, where we looked at labor migrants at the other end, and I've also been in charge of research that where Alexandra did work and where Ravi Srivastava from TNU did work, and I'm also drawing on some of the findings from that in an implicit manner. But first, the historical points. When one looks at Dalit oppression. There are actually different views of why they are oppressed and exploited. There's a standard historical materialist view held by and argued by, among others, Irfan Habib, Dharma Kumar, Jan Bremen, Rupa Vishwanath, that all sees the Dalits as primarily agricultural laborers that were in a slave-like position, that were treated abysmally by the landowners, that were by the landowners seen as untouchable in the sense that codified through the caste hierarchy and the religiously sanctioned pollution rules, they were seen as being polluting. Their touch was polluting, even their shadow might be polluting, and therefore they could be treated as the dominant caste saw fit, including sexual abuse, killings, boycotts, rape, etc. There are also other views. There's the view, the classic Brahminical, and also a main colonial view that actually these castes were mainly they were treated as polluting because they did polluting trades. So they weren't really, they may do agricultural labor, but that didn't matter so much. It was the polluting trade that matters. Weisser's The Hindu Jasmani System is one work that takes that view. And if that's the case, then of course the solution is for them to stop doing these polluting trades, then they're not polluting anymore. There's also a more recent view by Ramnarayan Rawat that claims really it was the colonial regime that created the downfall of the Dalits. They were actually small landowners before, and because of the colonial rule, they're suffering now. In which case, I guess the solution is somehow to give them back that position as landowners. So the different views leads to different positions, views of what should happen, and therefore they do matter a bit. We see them mattering already when we go on to the second historical point that I wish to make, and that is the historical, quite different strategies against oppression and discrimination of Dalits that have existed. Delonged clearly outlined them, others do too, that there has always been, or from the early 20th century, there's always been a reform-oriented path which accepted Hindu caste leadership, driven by early on organizations such as Arya Samaj, and later on, or fairly early still, RSS. So Dalits had to be incorporated into Hinduism and stop doing polluting things, and then they would be given, then Hindus would also stop discriminating against them. So there was a collaborative approach. But the alternative approach that's, for example, driven by reformers like Pule and Babasaheb Ambedkar was a much more confrontative approach, saying Dalits needed to do radical autonomy in relation to the caste Hindus. That was the only way they could reach freedom and escape discrimination. Now, if one looks at this in relation to what happened in UP from the 1920s onwards, then in fact, in the beginning of the 20th century, the Jata caste organizations did follow a classic self-improvement collaboration strategy, informed also by Arya Samaj. And so they fought for dignity and equal treatment and banned themselves from eating meat and alcohol, etc. But as Gupta and also Rawat has showed, already in the 1920s, the UP Dalits actually stopped doing this and instead started to demand specific and separate Dalit rights across the board, and started to ally themselves with Ambedkar's radical policies from then on. And that is actually not something all scholars of UP have spotted, but I think it's fairly clear that that is the case. On the ground, the Jata small town organizations also confronted Hindu caste peasants and landlords. For example, they did that in long struggle against Begar, which is forced labor, that became quite, from 1920s onwards, that became confrontational, that cost lives Rawat says in 46, over 100 Jathas were killed across UP as part of that struggle. There are also studies on the ground. There's particular one study by the anthropologist Bernard Cohn that reports from Jaunpur itself how from the 1920s Jathas started, how they saw the 1920s as a watershed moment where they went from the one strategy to the other, because as they stopped, as they refused to make dung cakes, as they refused to bring manure to the fields for the Takuras of course attacked them, beat them up, and the confrontation had started. And it led to them later on also joining other tenancy groups in a struggle both against the beggar and also for land reforms. So early on the ground, these struggles did take place. If we go from this and fast forward, and I'll return to some of these aspects later. If we fast forward to the 1990s, then of course there is a whole history that we drop or that we can't go into here, but just to, I've listed some of the main points here, from the outlawing of untouchability to affirmative action, to land reforms that only benefited non-Dalit castes, to the Green Revolution, the change in technology that meant much less work for Dalit or for Dalit laborers, because the mechanism that went with that, to the increase of informalized non-agricultural employment outside of agriculture, and a situation where in the 1990s, Dalit routinely migrated for work outside of agriculture. But in spite of all these changes, Dalit was still structurally stuck at the bottom of the Indian society economically and socially, also come the early 1990s. In fact, when we look at the early 1990s, when India embarked on its neoliberal policy reforms, Dalits were disproportionately poor compared to caste Hindus. 60% of all Dalits were below the poverty line compared to only 39% of caste Hindus. So one third more. So quite differently. And of course, still there were landless, etc., etc. That said, when I did conduct my first fieldwork, relation had changed from the historical situation. The extreme labor bondage had gone. The extreme purity pollution based oppression had also gone. Seasonal migration was quite common. In the East, where the Takuras dominated, the old dominant relations were most common. There, the Dalits were still all working in agriculture to some extent, some members of the household to some extent, and they were the beggared call. They had to come whenever the landlords wanted them. They had to do the jobs that the landlord wanted them to do. They had to deal with polluting trades, such as dealing with dead cow carcasses. They had to do beggar forced labor. So they were still in many ways oppressed and discriminated. In the Western village, in Muzaffarnagar, there the labor relations were more free in the sense they didn't do these things. They could in principle work for whoever they wanted. So now, as said, well, one can argue why these changes, and certainly part of it was that Dalits had migrated and therefore didn't work for the landowners, so only work for the landowners as they used to do, and also the Jats or the Chakos and the Jats had started moving out of agriculture, so it wasn't as important for them as it used to be what happened there. But the changes should also not be exaggerated. If one looks at what happened in the Western village, I've published on this, so I'll be short on that. But basically, the Jats, while they didn't dominate labor relations directly, they had established a British Republic where where outsiders had no access, where government has no access, where police had no access, where Dalits could vote, and where therefore they could treat Dalits the way they wanted. So very, very extreme kind of oppression, if not focused solely on the labor relation. Whereas paradoxically, in the Eastern UP village, where the old relation had continued more, there Dalits would go on strike every third year for higher wages. So they had degrees of freedom, which among other things related to the fact that there were the old landlords, and then there was a group of peasant farmers and themselves. So there wasn't this united dominance from all other groups on them as there were in the Jat village, where it was only the Jats and the Dalits really that were up against each other. All this changed in the 1990s when the BSP Bahujan Samaj party came to power, which was a Dalit party, and basically led to the crumbling of the village republic in the West, and it led to also it led to it becoming much more possible for the landowners to continue the physical abuse of Dalits. So beatings, killings, rape really stopped being the order of the day with that. So there were changes following my first visit, which I saw happening as my visits continued to the villages. I want to go to 2000 to my latest visits as soon as possible, because then I can make the comparison of what's happened over the last few decades. So, but first we still have to have the context, and if we're looking at what has happened in the last 20 years or so within agriculture, it's clear that agriculture is becoming less important as an area of employment for people, and for those that have land, they have less land. Land sizes is smaller. For those that work within agriculture, they have more of their income from outside of agriculture as well. So there are some clear changes. It's also clear that when we are looking at this period with enormous growth rates, 5 to 9% or so over the period from the 1990s up until COVID. Poverty did fall, but it fell much more among non-Dalits than among Dalits. We still had a situation in 2011 where poverty among Dalits were 3 times as high, no, 2 times as high as among general caste people. So poverty fell, but it was also linked to increasing inequalities, both income and wealth inequalities. That's also well documented. I won't go into that. That is standard knowledge that India is one of the most unequal societies in the world. Thomas Piketty World Inequality Report, for example, shows that very clearly. But throughout the period, right up until when I revisited in 2016 and 17, Dalits and Adivasis were thus stuck at the bottom of India. But they were very much incorporated into the modern economy during that period. And I've shown elsewhere in my work with Alpha Shah how that meant this incorporation was adverse incorporation. That meant that they were overrepresented in the worst segment of the non-agricultural workforce, including among the, maybe we don't know exactly how many, but one standard figure is the 100 million internal seasonal migrant laborers, where they worked in the worst jobs as seasonal migrants in the construction sector, in brick kiln sectors, and in low-end industrial work, and as agricultural labor. And when they did that and stayed at the bottom, when they migrated, they were also routinely denied their rights, be they labor rights or civil rights, access or rights to access to schools, to health services, to voting, where they have gone to access to subsidized food, etc. So they were treated, they were discriminated against when they migrated in their lowest work, both as workers and as citizens. We have called this that they suffered from structural labor market discrimination. And I think it's just worth pointing out what we mean by that. That consists of 3 aspects of discrimination. direct labor market discrimination, where people of same skill set, one is preferred to the other based on race, ethnicity, etc. Also discrimination in accessing skills, and also historical discrimination or disadvantage due to historical oppression and exploitation. So where so there are three levels when one is discussing discrimination. When I talk about discrimination, I talk about all three levels at the same time, more or less, and I call that structural labor market discrimination. And it's very clear, shown that exists in India, that it exists in the UK, that it exists in the US, etc. Okay, moving to the villages, 2017-18. Now, it's clear. It was clear when I returned for the visits before COVID, compared to the 1990s, there had been a decrease in poverty and an increase in inequality. That, for example, housing had improved significantly for all castes. That access to amenities had improved significantly for all castes, but also that they had done so excessively more for the landed groups than the Dalits. And here I've thrown some figures in, just who have the cars, who have access to water coolers, etc. One could have gone on, and I think this is the Tacos in East UP in their houses, and these are Dalits in. So it is not only inequality, it was actually enormous inequality. I realized as I started to understand what had changed over the last 20 years there, because some of the Tacos, especially of the Tacos, but also the Jats, had really entered what was the stratosphere economically. It was the non-agricultural income that had really increased, whereas agriculture had taken a backseat. For example, one Taco household had been able to invest the equivalent of £1 million of his own money setting up a school, having a school built and setting it up and running it as a business. It was money he had made when he, in his early, mid-20s, joined a UP Taco group that had managed to become engaged in illicit construction works around Mumbai. It was some other Tacos that built or had the money to build, and they built it. And so they made good money on that. Others would make money on similar ways. Many Tacos and Jat households were heavily engaged in very lucrative urban businesses and services, from IT to manufacturing, construction, law firms, and also had quite decent government jobs. For example, being a secretary, special secretary in the tax department is a good place to be. And so many owned flats or houses in major cities. The Jatas, on the other hand, were less poor, but they were stuck where they had always been, more or less. Say a bit more about that later. So land ownership was therefore also reflected this, as it always had done. So land belonged to the Tacos and the Jats. And going on to occupations, so getting a handle on what these differences are, I have here made a couple of different figures that I will show, that I'll just explain. So here we have what I call good jobs and low-end jobs and okay jobs. And as you can see, so the landed caste have good jobs, and the others have not so good jobs. But if one goes into the details of that, say take the Tacos here, then they some of them have land only, but most of them are in governments or professionals, or have run large scale and medium businesses, or have good private sector jobs. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, I've been trying to come up with some cutoff points, and this is work in progress. If one look at the unskilled jobs and petty businesses that the low caste have, that is jobs where you earn less than 10,000 rupees a month. Then there are jobs, the ones I have classified over there as okay jobs, where you earn between 10 and 20,000 rupees a month, and that will be, for example, if you're a skilled worker with a certificate in an ITI certificate, so you can get a job as an informal laborer in the automotive industry. Then you start by 8,500 first year, and next year 12,000. You can go up to 16,000. So that's informal. It's only 9 months a year at most, but it's better than working in a brick kiln for 6,000. Rupees. And above 20,000, you start to have the jobs where you are a foreman, where you're in charge of other workers, or where you have leadership roles. So when we're talking about the good jobs, where we got it, private sector, good private sector jobs, that is that kind of jobs. And you can see that is practically the worst jobs you can have as a taco or a jat, whereas it is close to the best jobs you can have as a jatter. Within agriculture, so let me give you a couple of other examples of what they do. One guy had swindled one taco had swindled his in-laws family out of a sweatshop they owned near Delhi, and then he'd sold it, and he had used the money to buy to get himself set up as the local fair price shop, so he could extract money from that. And now he runs various shady businesses that I'm not entirely sure what it is, but that is his history. There was the guy who did an IT degree at JNU and set up businesses in just outside JNU, where he has a couple of employees who run his IT shop. And there's the law firm in Jaunpur. I mean, this is what they do. They have the connections and they can use them, and they do. Now they also do agriculture, but they don't do it very much. They still have the land, and they say those that have jobs outside, they say, well, it probably provides around 20%, 25% of our income. Most of them actually don't till the land anymore themselves. They haven't got time, so they lease it out. 66% of the land is leased out by now. So they've gone down to previous ways of tilling the lands, because they do that for totally rational reasons, because they're too busy making big money out of agriculture, so they can't engage in it here. Those that keep the land, many of them employ permanent agricultural laborers, again, something that existed kind of before the Green Revolution mainly. They have come back in as well. I think 19 of those ones are here as well. So we see capitalist landlord principles being applied there by these high-flying people that are engaging in modern capitalist activities. In the Muzaffarnagar village, we have a trajectory that is reasonably the same, but you can also see that many more Dalits are still doing landowning. They say, those that work outside of agriculture, they say that you need both land and outside of agriculture to do really well. But they say that agriculture counts around 50% of their income. Of course, it varies from people to people, but that's not a standard saying. It's around 50%. So they grow sugarcane, they have high government prices, they have political power to maintain that, to go up and up. So they're probably true that they earn a lot more from their agriculture than the tacos do. Though tacos say it's also going well, they're not moaning. But the Jats make more money from agriculture than they do, and it matters more for them. They are mainly outside services. They are still mainly in the army. The army is an old congregation point for Jats. They were a martial race. The Brits put them in the army. In a sense, they had affirmative action. They had always got access to the army. And these jobs, if you are a sepoy, you start by 22,000 rupees monthly salary plus 25% extras, and you end up, if you are a lieutenant, before you retire at 52, you earn up towards, let me see if I can find it. I think you earn up to around 50,000 plus. No, you earn 100,000 rupees plus allowances, 125,000 rupees at the end of a career. And then you retire at the latest when you're 52, and you get half your salary for the rest of your life. So it's a good income, but it's not this extreme that the Thakurs have managed. Some of them have also managed that, but fewer of them have done that. For example, one is the private secretary to a top politicians in UP, and they have a very big house. So there are ways of making money there as well. Okay, there is among the Dalits in particular also some differentiation the other way. There are a few households, 8 households or 3%, that were either landless or had found it necessary to take up the low-paid work that I talked about. So 2 were casual daily laborers, so earning well below 10,000 a month. So among the Dalits, there were some not very prevalent, but still some differentiation in both directions. Okay, and Dalits, of course, didn't lease out their land at all because they were too busy making money from the land. And here we have some Dalits with their houses and their cars. And let us move on to the Jathas were obviously not doing quite so well. So they were mainly in the low-end jobs, more so in Muzaffarnagar than in Jaunpur. Compared to, but they still see major changes. They had moved out of agriculture to a very large extent. Back in 93, most households almost did some agricultural labor. Now, particularly in Jaunpur, only 1% of the household considered agricultural labor as their main source. In Muzaffarnagar, it was somewhat higher, but it was still quite low. Many did some agricultural labor next to other things they did. And it also happens that a good number of households of the Jathas households in Jaunpur had a bit of land, tiny bit of land, and they leased in the land from the Thakurs. So from that they could make a tiny bit of income. And when we look at the other was the men. If we look at the women, we can see women in Jaunpur in particular work on the land they have leased in, or as agricultural labor a lot, whereas in Muzaffarnagar it is more as agricultural labor they work. But they are, you see, very high work participation ratio, which is also interesting. It's in India it is 24%, isn't it? The standard work participation ratio. Here we're talking work, we're using the terms of productive work, which as recognized by the statistics. We're talking work participation ratio of 70 to 72% here. So there's been this move out of agriculture also for the Jathas, but mainly to low-end places. It is also clear that there's a difference. The Jaunpur Jathas have done better. They have gone into jobs that are we saw it before. We can see it again here. Construction, semi-skilled, informal, semi-skilled, in salary, white-collar workers, skilled workers. It is the It is the Jaunpur people that dominate there, whereas the Muzaffarnagar people are in brick kilns much more than anything else. So changes, slightly different changes in the two villages. There are also a couple of catch-lists among the Jatos. They're not doing well necessarily, but there are some. This guy, he worked in a brick kiln in Haryana for 13 years and became friendly with a Jat that helped him start the business where he got two tractors and ferried bricks from kiln to elsewhere. But he had to move back because of marriage issues with the children. And here he got one job, was cheated by the Jats that gave him the job, and simply has given up. He said, "No, I can't do work here because I can't trust people here. I'm a Jat will cheat me." So his two tractors sits there and he doesn't know quite what to do. Two others are politicians that have, because they're reserved posts, so sometimes a Dalit will have to be the local mayor, the local Pradhan, and then you can make money through corruption, and they have done well in that field and have established themselves. But that is it. Others, there are not others that have that sort of extended reproduction as these few people have. There are some professionals, there are two people working in Gulfs. In the Gulf, they're making good money, but they're still not there to actually invest and start living off other people's work. Now, other things have changed. What we're seeing here is the kind of oppression we saw before has gone. We do not anymore have beggar. So there's no forced labor. The last lending or borrowing relations between the farmers and the Jatas stopped in the early 2000s because it was the Thakurs that had done it up till then. They didn't dare to do it any longer because they were worried that it would be seen that they would be accused under the anti-caste discrimination laws for being usurious moneylenders to Jatas. So they simply didn't dare to do it. The Jatas stopped cleaning plates after festivals, which is another polluting task. They stopped dealing with cow carcasses, so the Thakurs now have to call in the municipal service, which is very slow, so they dislike it. So all these classical kind of religiously inspired oppressive ways of oppressing Jatas have gone in both villages. Purity pollution has really lost its importance. In the Jat village, Jats have always been less. They have relied less on purity pollution than the Thakurs. But now, last time I was there, one of the Jats, he had a Jata woman cooking for him every day and eating the foods that the Dalit cooked. And they would share, they would drink tea from cups, which used to be a no, you can't share cups and so on. They would do that as well here. So it isn't that violence had stopped in these villages. It's just that it wasn't directed this unidirectionally against the Jatas anymore. That'd been in Muzaffarnagar, there was a major killing of Muslims a few years before I was there. 63 people died in riots, as it's called. The host I stayed with, his son had been killed. The Pradhan's son was out on bail for another killing. I mean, violence is endemic, but it wasn't just against Dalits anymore. They were not this easy target that they used to be. Trying to sum up these labor relations a bit. So clearly we have a situation where the Thakurs of Jaunpur really, for them, agriculture doesn't matter as much as before. And they have the connections outside of agriculture because of being Thakuras. They have the connections that really can make them go far. And these similarities, actually, there's another study from a nearby village that certainly when it comes to agriculture shows the same, that the Thakuras really aren't interested in agriculture. They're too busy making money elsewhere. The Dalits of Muzaffarnagar, they're of course trying the same. They can't quite do the same. They can accumulate, but not at that extreme level as the Thakuras. After all, this is a peasant caste, a dominant peasant caste, but it was never an old landlord caste with those direct connections. The Dalit house, as I've said before, those villages, less poverty, increased inequality, and if one is to point out why have the Jatas of the Jaunpur village done better than that of the Muzaffarnagar village, well, some people will say, well, this is a case of because agriculture is more important for the Jats, then they will oppress people more, and there are studies showing that elsewhere in India that is often the case. But this actually goes back further, and this goes back to the 90s as well, when the Thakuras still were trying to make money out of agriculture. And I think it's got to do with the power relations that changed in East UP with land reforms, when certain other castes got land and therefore became a pole of power. So Thakuras at village level aren't as dominant any longer as they used to be. And that is underlying that the Jatas for long have been able to get education and find their way into jobs from the 90s. I mean, I'm not saying that I can see how the agriculture, how you need to oppress people more to squeeze them if agriculture really matters to you. But it is more the overall power position of Jats that always have made it difficult for the Jatas to get the education, to get the jobs elsewhere. So there's also a changing nature of oppression. I think it's quite clear that what we're seeing now is really a naked power-related structural labor discrimination that is replacing the purity pollution based discrimination that we saw before, both in labor relations and generally. It's gone. In relation to the Jatas, it's gone, but they're still oppressed. It's just so using that we are the powerful, you're not. So in that sense, I think what we see with neoliberalism is that we've seen a stratified labor market based on power, not on religious symbolism anymore. There are also differences, and one needs to understand these differences if one wants to actually understand what goes on the ground. Because if it is power, then how powerful you are matters. And I think to understand the different position of different Jata groups and others, one has to understand the powerful or the power relations they're involved in order to see what they can do and what they can't do. And it's also interesting to see that the way they've progressed here, the Dalits, the Jatas, is really very much in opposition to the ruling classes in the villages. It is not that they've tried to get subs from them. They have cut connections. They've stopped taking money. They've stopped this and that. So in that sense, it's back to they continue that strategy of gaining benefits through their own power and not through becoming part of the Hindu mainstream. There are others that do differently. There's a great example. There's an example of how the Valmikis, another caste in the Jat village, have done quite well because they have always been close to the Jats, and the Jats have helped them to get jobs in factories, good jobs in factories. So they moved out and so on and so forth. So there's another strategy as well. But for the Jatas, it is this confrontational strategy that has always been their way of doing things. What I find interesting in this is really that by now there are good studies of how oppression takes place of the Dalits when they migrate, when they are in the construction sector, when they are in brick kilns, when they are in factories. But there actually aren't very, very good studies that look at what has happened to the way oppression and labor relations have changed back in the villages. There are sort of metric understandings of it, but they aren't looking at the power relations and the oppression. So I thought that was something that it was interesting to see how it also here had become much less religiously based. That said, this is a truth with some very important caveats. Jatas is the most politically mobilized Dalit caste in UP, and not all other castes, not all Dalits are in the same situation. So what the Thakurs and Jats have done is that they have rolled back, stepped back from the Jatas, and instead oppressed other groups. So, for example, in Jaunpur, the worst of agricultural laborers belong to another Dalit caste that's called Musaras, which are seen. Some people have, and I don't know if well, among the Thakurs, they are called the Adivasis of the Dalits, which is a way of saying they are worse off than all the others. And I can. There's not time to tell stories, but they're really an interesting group. They have the worst jobs. They are the permanent laborers. They work in brick kilns. In the brick kilns also, because there are brick kilns in Jaunpur, it is not the local people, but it's apart from Musaras, but it is migrant people from mainly Adivasis, but also Dalits from Jharkhand that work. So not the local people. So their low wages and harsh conditions are given to others. In Muzaffarnagar, where the Jatas have moved out of agriculture. Instead, we now have a large group of migrant sugarcane harvesters from Bihar, from East UP, from Jharkhand, that have taken up some of their jobs, again as permanent laborers on 8 months contracts, most often, again paid much less and given sleeping on the veranda, etc. So quite a different situation compared to that of the Jatas. And elsewhere in UP, there are studies that shows appalling conditions for local workers as well. There's a study from elsewhere in Muzaffarnagar by Kamal Singh that shows that in that place, which is actually a Rajput-dominated village, there's still these loan tie-ins, there's still bonded labor, there's still strong oppression. So I have these two villages I've looked at. I can't. So but one should be aware that they're only part of the picture. There are quite some other things going on as well. Now. It is also the case that the labor is very much a part of the complex, wider political reality. And it is well known by anyone that know anything about India that the ruling Hindu fundamentalist party, BJP, and its mass organizations have been quite aggressively implementing a cow slaughter ban, mainly aimed at Muslims, but also to some extent of Dalits, because Dalits eat meat and work with skinning hides. And it is well known that there are cow vigilante patrols, such as this one that was so pleased with the beating up of some Dalits in Una in Gujarat that they videoed it and put it on Facebook, their great deeds. So there is discrimination or oppression taking place at sort of more general level that is not labor specific. There's of also gang rape, caste-based murders. It's read the papers, they're all there. So it's important, but what I think is important is to say that all this does not alter the picture of the direction of travel towards structural Dalit labor discrimination that is not directly regulated by classic Hindu religious purity pollution principles. They're harsh, they're terrible, but it's not the old purity pollution that is the main issue here. It is a reworking of religion so it becomes more anti-Muslim. It is simply power being displayed. And intriguingly, perhaps, this move away from purity pollution oppression also seems to be trajectory promoted by the ruling Hindu fundamentalist party. It has for some years now pursued an agenda of including OBCs and also Dalits and Adivasis within the Hindu fold, in line with the old Arya Samaj policies. And this new Hinduism that they want them included in is much less purity pollution based, but it's also more oppressive and more violent against those that are deemed to be the other. So in relation to Dalits, this exclusion-inclusion perspective also involves the appropriation of the Baba Saheb Ambedkar as a new Hindu fundamentalist, nationalist hero. And it also involves welfare policies, double PDS rations, cooking gas, and whatnot. But at the same time, on the income side, this inclusion is combined with significant initiatives worsening the conditions of the low-end informalized laborers. The BJP is deepening the existing structural labor discrimination while allowing Dalits into the Hindu fold, or more correctly, into their Hindu ultra-nationalist fundamentalist agenda, which at the same time oppresses those that do not fit in. So, another aspect of this is that they really then push down hard on anyone that are against this agenda. And one example of that is that Ananta Tumde and Dalit intellectual or organic intellectual who argued for a Dalit left alliance against this policy. Him and others have been jailed in the so-called Bimad Koregaon case, in what clearly appears to be unsubstantial charges of treason and conspiracy. Also, Dalit labor union activists have been hit by this. Leading activist of the Mumbai Electric Employees Union that organized the Dalit migrant workers in Mumbai in this sector were jailed on charges relating to their so far unproven connections to the armed Naxalite movement. So I would suggest that India's caste-based labor discrimination is following a trajectory similar to that of racialized labor discrimination in most parts of the world. Globally, the old racist justifications for discrimination and oppression can no longer be said out loud by the respectable mainstream. However, demeaning versions of such justifications are maintained by broad sections of the public, including by workers from the dominant ethnic groups who seek to defend the small advantages that it gives them. So racialized discrimination could be said to be mutating, as the racialized tropes cannot be spoken openly as they were before. And this doesn't mean that structural racial labor discrimination doesn't exist, of course. We know it very, very well exists globally, but it has a less direct relation to the old racial tropes. So in India, the focus on the Muslim minority by the Hindu right, as well as by the historical organizations such as the Arya Samaj, has given its politics in relation to Dalit labor discrimination and oppression this particular discrimination but inclusion characteristics. But this kind of inclusion has of course not stopped the atrocities against Dalits, nor stopped the Dalit labor discrimination. I think one can argue that this has furthered the ongoing modernization of Dalit labor discrimination, in line with what has happened elsewhere in the world. It may have sped up the move towards, it may even have sped up the move towards this kind of structural Dalit labor discrimination, with very little overtly spoken or acted out purity pollution vestiges, but within a draconian BJP Hinduism related oppressive framework. And I think these wider perspectives do matter also for village studies, such as the one I've been reporting on here, to understand the relations and understand what secularism means and what it also doesn't mean by way of freedoms. And I think that is my main conclusion. I think the other, so there are many other conclusions on the way, and one I would just highlight here as well is that it does seem to me that to understand the labor relations involving Dalits and to understand politics involving Dalits, it is time to drop the category Dalits as unit of research, because the differences are just so extreme within this group, both between different castes, but also within the same or from place to place. So to me, it's become a broad category that say, yes, these people are probably oppressed, probably work by selling their labor, but the specifics of it can only be investigated through much more specific studies, as far as I can see. That is all I have to say. Thank
you. Sharing.
Yeah.
Would you like to
where do we?
I think
Yeah.
where was a sound will pick it. Okay, great. Thanks, Jens. Thanks for this broad sweep and with much to unpack. And I must say, ending on a very provocative note around sort of, dropping the category of Dalits. I'm sure I assume people would have some things to say about this. So of course, we're open for questions and answers. If you're online, please, you can raise your hand sort of with that button on the bottom screen, or type your question in the chat and we'll come to you. If not here, please raise your hand and I will come to you. So while everyone gathers their thoughts, I'll open up with a couple of questions of my own. I have a lot of questions, but I think one is, so there are two questions that I want to ask. One is around this idea that, the kind of purity pollution is, we are moving away from it. Except that the case that you present to us is, of one Dalit group. So you talked about the Jatavs, and then you present to us in the next breath another kind of category of the Musahars and other migrants. And I wonder if, and you also say that, kind of the dominant castes have moved away sort of from the Jatavs and got those other groups to do the worst kind of agricultural work. And so I wonder if, the form of caste oppression, as you say, which has changed from purity pollution, has just moved to, has moved from just one group, and it doesn't then translate to the other groups who are still doing these really kind of, the worst kind of work that is possible. So I think there's this question of, whether the form has changed or if there is something quite specific in that case that has changed. I think the other thing I'm curious to hear more from you about, is the kind of political question. Since that's where you ended, and one can come at it from many different ways. But there is the slightly more kind of empirical question around. So if they've moved away from agricultural work, say the Jatavs, so their struggle then against sort of caste discrimination, I suppose, is then has to be outside of the point of production. And to what extent that is the case, and if not, where is the struggle kind of going? Is it for state resources? Of course, you mentioned the state in terms of land reforms and so on, but we've heard not much otherwise about it. So, where are they kind of directing their struggles, right? And then there's a slightly there's a bit of an like I suppose a more kind of theoretical question. So the idea of sort of class, caste, this conjugated oppression of these different categories that come together. I just wonder if you have a sense of like when, because these are also sort of contingent intersections, and as you say, they are kind of historically produced and then they change over time. Is it that one, are there instances where one identity would matter more than the other? in terms of how people are mobilized, when they come into action. And so how does that intersection translate in terms of political action? So big questions. So I'll let you answer while others think.
Yes, thanks. Yes, those are indeed complications, which I, of course, can only answer partially. But so first was about the form of caste oppression. What is happening when other groups become the core of the worst labor relations? So I certainly didn't mean to paint a sort of a harmonious or positive picture of the oppressive relations that exist at village level. But I wanted to point out that I found very little that relates to purity pollution in them. And I also didn't find that when it came to the Musaharas, for example. I mean, they were just being abominably exploited, but not based on so they didn't. So in 93, when you had worked for the Chacos and you came to be paid, you had to stop outside the courtyards. You had to stand looking down and wait for the Chaco to come to you. Under no circumstances could you enter the courtyard. Dalits had no access. I now see Musaharas going into the courtyards of Chacos. And these norms that used to exist, that were formally based on purity pollution. Of course, the reality were displaying power relations. The power relations still exist, but they are not displayed using those idioms anymore, as far as I can see. And that might well, I mean, they still can't enter certain temples and so on, but those day-to-day purity pollution enforcement of power relations are much less. In 93, the guy who now is in the tax department, he was one of those who would dare to go and sit and drink tea with the yatas. He was the one or two of the people that I saw doing that. Now it's not a big thing. I mean, things have changed from that. Oppression hasn't. Oppression is still there. So that was what I wanted to point out. There's clearly also to answer when caste and class and identities are there cases where some identities matters more than others. I mean, yes, there are, and I guess that has always been the case. This brilliant PhD by Bernard Cohn, which hasn't been published but exists in a photocopy in the library here, has a section on how from early 19th century, from early 20th century, Dalits or Jatas migrated and came back to the village. Some managed to buy land, and when he described who took part in which actions against the Chacos, it depended on your relation. Those with the land could take action because they had nothing to lose, whereas those that were indebted to them found it harder to do so. I mean, so yes, it's still the case. Those with government jobs, they are there to anything that attacks the caste honor, they will stand up for, but they're not going on strike or boycotting the Chacos for higher wages because they're conservative in a sense. So there is difference within the Jata groups, depending on certainly some with direct class and others just your overall position, economic position, but so far they can unite when their honor is which means oppression in a way that they feel hit all of them, then they will unite. The political question, moving away from agriculture, of course, they want more from government. They want government jobs. That is unsurprising. The Jatas would like government jobs, but they're also well aware that there aren't many left. because that's another thing with neoliberalism, the cutback of the state. So affirmative action doesn't work anymore because there are hardly any jobs. What they want is ITI certificates. They want qualifications so they can go and get better jobs. That's the big thing, and it was actually the case in the Jaunpur village already back in the 1990s. But there was a big focus on that. But now, so it is. They want to improve their access to good jobs outside of agriculture. That is the main thing. And so even in the Jaunpur village, where obviously a large majority, a large group of the Jathas actually live inland, they claim that they do not want to work in agriculture. So even though they actually do it, this is the outside world that they really want to get more into.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ian. I have two questions, and this is pretty amazing to have the sort of span of so many different stories interconnected. I wonder first on the genders of your story, because is it a story of racialized masculinities? They're shifting, they're you telling? Because I haven't, the imageries that I get back is perhaps more in relation to this. And instead, if we can trace intersections with gender that go beyond that, there has been a movement in that sense or not, in the new types of processes of racialization that you have mentioned towards the end. And relatedly, perhaps, I do wonder about debt, because debt has been a structuring element for attachment for a long time, and of course for Dalits and for low-caste Muslims and a lot of, and I would say that also already in the period of neo-bondage that Jan Bremer was talking about. So I wonder now, in a context where instead you have the Thakurs that basically don't employ necessarily, what happens to credit? And if the new incoming sort of racialized mobile labor has a relation to debt and credit advances that recall the old forms of attachment for people that stay, or if it's an entirely different ballgame now. Because when we talk about modernization of racialized labor, I think the question of credit and how it interlocks with labor for India is quite a central one. Thank you.
I think you have a question linked to that, Anand.
No, actually mine is not linked to that, so it's fine, I can come later.
Oh, okay. You want to take that?
Whatever you want me to. So,
okay, why don't you answer those?
Okay, so there's absolutely no doubt that my studies suffered from the fact that I'm male, and that while I had a female assistant back in '93, it didn't go that far as it should, and it means that when I returned later on, I returned with a research assistant that was also male. So there are limits to what I can say about intersectionality, about masculinities and how they've changed over time. I can say it is quite clear that Jatha women in Jaunpur have been good at some of them have managed to get jobs also outside of agriculture. And that all of them, the work participation ratio is extraordinary here compared to what we are told it is across India for Dalits. So there is clearly and this is not driven by, this is not the most poor group you can find. It is not that they just have to do it in order to so very basically survive. It is to have a good life. They work and they have a position. And I can't say much about how that position has changed. One of the things that I've always wanted to understand better is what it meant for gender relations, that men migrate and women stay back. What does that mean for the position of but I don't know. So I have to shamefully admit my shortcomings in that area. And when it comes to indebtedness, now in both these villages, well, in Jaunpur, as I said, the Thakur stopped lending money to Dalits in early 2000s. In Muzaffarnagar, the Dalits had already stopped borrowing from the Jats back in the 90s. So those connections are very well and truly cut. The Jatas now say there are enough well-off people within the community to borrow from them. Though, as far as I could see, some of them were also borrowing from the more modern pawn shops that exist in the local towns where the rates will be higher. I have not done a proper study of that either, but it's clear that debt is not structuring the direct labor relations here. For the seasonal migrant laborers, they get an advance. So the advance is around around or less than 1 month's pay. So what I think the main issue that keeps them in some sort of new bondage is that they're not paid till the end of the season. Not so much that 1 month's advances they get, because in a sense that you're over quite quickly. But you're not paid till the end. And there are still, back in the 90s, there were stories about how people were cheated. There are still stories about such migrants, how they're cheated in the end and are not getting their due. So that is, and they have to hold on till they get paid, of course. And that is a way of keeping them exploiting them.
You can go first. I know you have to be.
No, I'm very much an interloper in terms of the specialism of this seminar, so please bear that in mind. But it's really wonderful to have a talk that both combines that sort of depth with that breadth over. It's very hard to do over such a long period, and it's really great to see. So actually, I wanted to follow up and my question on some of the questions that both Shreya and Adi raised, and they're mostly requests for more information. I'm very much in sympathy with your general argument, which is that we are seeing here a secularization of caste and caste becoming, if you like, class-like in many ways, and that purity and pollution as the religious aspects are declining. And I just wanted to add by way of footnote that the very limited field work that I've done in UP following Dalit female MPs in their constituencies has been really interesting. I was interested in seeing how these masculine models of power, how they react to women Dalit MPs, and it's very interesting. The Thakur and Brahmin men will touch the feet of the Dalit women MPs, and so on and so forth. And there are other issues about some of these Dalit families are owners of brick kilns and are and then employing others and so on. So I mean much of that would concur with in other parts of Europe. It's obviously not fieldwork with the kinds of length of time that we conduct. So my questions then were related to that, to politics, and to how much you see, say, political power here, or being either a source of capital accumulation or of changing, bringing about, or a factor in bringing about the reduction in poverty among Jatas, which can be both direct in terms of them, as it were, whether in positions, reserved positions as MPs, as MLAs, as Pradhans, etc. But also with, as you alluded to, having the BSP in power, right? Having your person belonging to your community in power, how much that has, in your estimation, contributed to the changes in relation to poverty, and what the role of other policies has been. So MNREGA, does it have any impact at all here? Indeed, I mean, the Ambedkar Village scheme that I think to some extent the government did, the BSP government did. So to an economic liberalization, which is a whole third sort of set of policies. So could you give us some of that? And again, going back to that data that you presented, it would be useful to see public versus private employment, and what is the proportions, what are the proportions here, how have those changed a little bit over time. So I was just, it's a request for more information on all of those grounds, but I generally, my limited findings would also concur with yours there. I'll stop there.
I'll take one more question and then thanks.
Thanks, Jens. It was a very interesting presentation and thoroughly, and economics, of course, has a lot to learn in terms of broad statements we tend to say about caste in India. So I have two connected questions. One is that there have always been these inequalities that have existed even within Dalits, when you were talking about Dalits at the end. And those inequalities have intertwined with the economic relations. So is now what you're talking about something specifically distinct about those, or is it just a changed form of something that would have probably persisted in different ways in different times? And to that relates my second question, which has been like the biggest pain of the Indian left, is that there is the argument one of the key takeaways from it be that we should organize them along class lines and not so much along caste if people are basically moving, kind of certain caste groups are then able to kind of transition. And what's the implication for Dalit politics? Thanks.
I don't think I can answer the last question, but just to to start with the first questions here. So poverty reduction and how that relates to various programs and public-private employment over time. Historically, that means for me in the early 90s, the ones that were well off had government jobs among the Jatas. They were teachers, with one or two exceptions. There was one that had land before that because his family had been a village servant. But the others were all teachers, and there weren't many, but the ones that had that position. Today, you can still trace those families where by now the retired person or the deceased person was a teacher, and you can see how that in most cases had given them the opportunity to get into the professions or start a business or get a good job. Rarely within government now, because reservations as an area that is available that is not only something I'm saying, it's also they're saying hardly exist anymore. There are hardly any jobs coming up. Of course, it's got to do with neoliberalism, cut back of the state sector, cut back also of state schools, and instead of setting up private schools, there are quite a few of the Dalits that work in private schools where you've got no security. I don't know if you've got pension, but you certainly have a low pay as well. So the old government jobs is hardly an issue for them anymore. The BSP has had a major impact politically, because it meant that overt caste discrimination could be complained at and could be I mean, if a Thakur raped a Dalit woman, the likelihood was he would go to jail, at least for a little while. So that changed a lot. It didn't change much economically. This one village was actually an Ambedkar village, and it did mean something for access to education. But the big program seems to be Narega in the one village, where the old elderly women work as much as they can for that. In the other village, it doesn't seem to exist. So there are, of course, other policies, but that's just a very broad sketch of the situation. Inequalities within Dalits, they've always existed. Yes, true.
Yes, ask your question, answer a little briefly. I think there are lots of people
Also,
online waiting.
sorry. Okay, so inequalities. yes, there have always been inequalities. I think it's very interesting to see how the access even to the kind of not very good jobs outside of agriculture now, in a sense, reflects those existing inequalities. And how when some groups go from being rock bottom to just one step off rock bottom, other groups then fit and take that in. So yes, you could say it is based on the old inequalities, but it is how the modern capitalist economy integrates those inequalities and makes use of them that I think is so fascinating in looking at even these specific Dalit castes. And I will not try and answer that in politics, but well, maybe organizing. Sorry, yes. I think for nearly all the Jata I've spoken to, it is the oppression as it is still being Dalit and being oppressed as a Dalit that takes form. That is their main issue. And as long as organizations do not try to organize them, recognizing that, I think they would find it hard to organize.
Jens, people want to ask questions online. The various people who want to ask questions.
Yeah, exactly.
Jan Bremen and
Online.
Sharpan Adnan want to ask questions from a long time ago.
Okay,
It's
sorry,
time to
Chris,
give
we're
them
just moving
space.
online now. So I think Shapan and then Jan.
Well, Jan had asked earlier to ask the question.
Okay, well, Jan, sorry, I can't see from where I'm sitting. Jan and then Shapan.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, she stopped
Thank
sharing.
you. Thanks, Jens, for a beautiful presentation. The upshot of your argumentation is that labor discrimination and exploitation has become more class-based than caste-based, although it seems to operate very much through the caste nexus. But that's not the main point I'd like to make. What I observe is that there is no reference to the current political regime of India. To cut a longer comment short, can you confirm, Jens, that the Dalits, for a large part, have joined the vote bank of Hindutva? And if so, why is that? Is it the old Sarkari Mabab, waiting for the freebies? Is it intimidation? Is it fear? Is it disillusionment with the preceding regime, Congress regime? Could you comment briefly on the Dalits, the position of the Dalits, and their role in the Hindutva politics?
Thank you, Jan. Shapan, do you want to ask a question now?
Thank you. First of all, Jens, a very interesting presentation of trends, a kind of overview of changes in caste and class relations, as well as patterns of accumulation and political conflicts. I have a few questions to ask, which I'll try and make it in terms of bullet points. The first is with respect to the notion of structural discrimination. Now, if I draw an analogy with the idea of structural violence, the idea there was that this is the kind of violence which is not directly inflicted. In other words, it cannot be attributed to a particular agent, and it is anonymous and therefore a kind of structural thing. Now, I wonder if your notion of structural discrimination follows the similar pattern. I noted that you mentioned amongst different mechanisms, direct market forms of discrimination. Therefore, does this imply that your notion of structural discrimination combines both direct and indirect mechanisms? Number two is about the differentiation among Dalits themselves. This is, of course, well known. My question is there any kind of direct political or direct oppression of non-Jatav Dalits by the Jatavs? I mean, do we have a reproduction of the power relations that exists between the dominant caste and the Dalits in the case of Jatavs and the non-Dalits? My third question is about the othering. Is one to conclude that in the past, for the dominant Hindu castes, the others were the Dalits and the Muslims, and that there has been now a shift in which the othering is primarily of Muslims, whereas Dalits are seen as part of the Hindu fold, and the doctrine of Hindutva is actively trying to incorporate them. My last question is about shifts in accumulation. You show how accumulation patterns have changed, particularly with neoliberalism, and I noted that you provided detailed mapping of the sources, the sectoral sources of surplus and therefore expanded reproduction. And so, from what I understand, the changes in accumulation that you note are pertain to sectoral patterns of accumulation. But I wonder if you also have some observations to make on the nature of accumulation. For example, has it shifted from, had there been a period of taking away land of the Dalits, which would perhaps correspond to primitive accumulation, and a shift towards production in both agriculture and non-agriculture, which makes use of that land in more capitalist forms? In other words, in terms of the shift in accumulation, do you have any observations on the trend in terms of primitive and capitalist accumulation?
Sorry, thank you, Chapan, and thanks also for everyone's patience in getting to the Zoom questions. Can I just read Ravi's question, because it's also linked to what Chapan has just asked, which is that your case is about the Jatavs, but not the other groups, for whom not much has changed. So, and then your presentation also begs the question of how desperate the situation is in Eastern UP, Bihar, West Bengal, that they would rather prefer to live the life of migrant labor in UP and so on. So I think there's a question. He was reminded also of Paulo Freire, and he said that the newly freed may in turn oppress a section of the population that are still oppressed. So I suppose also this question of, the Dalits is not a homogeneous group. And an associated question on what is the prevalence of industrial agriculture and contract farming, and is there a door open for the corporatization of agriculture? Yeah. And now you can try to answer all of this together.
Thanks so much for those questions. And yes, some of them are probably questions I will have to think more about, but some of them I will try and give some tentative answers to. So first to young Raymond's questions, let me just start by saying I didn't mean to indicate that oppression and exploitation was now more class than caste based, more that the way caste was used now was to slot people in within different kinds of jobs at different levels. So that means it is still caste that decides, still caste discrimination that decides your class position. So in that sense, caste matters a lot for where you are. People with the same qualifications will end up in very different places simply because of their caste background. That is something which this study shows, and is something that it can documented across India in various ways. Now, the Dalit Hindutva link is, of course, extremely interesting. It is not something I can say a lot about, in the sense that the Jatas are very much all of them are anti-BJP. That, well, all but one of them are very much anti-BJP. They are BSP or they are Bimani people. They are for Dalit emancipation in various ways. They're not buying into the BSP Hindutva. But of course, Dalits per se, you can see in figures and read in analysis, many other Dalit groups do support BJP. I haven't got a particular field-based analysis of that, but it's clear that so from what I read, it seems that the welfare programs that the government has put in place over the last 5, 6, 7 years have had an impact. But I can't go much further than that, because for the Jatas, this is absolutely not the case. Structural discrimination. Firstly, it's yes, that to me is quite central to an understanding of how caste is being transformed and how it is being expressed in the hierarchy of exploitation today. And you're probably right that your comparison to structural violence is interesting. I haven't made that before, and I can see how categories, if one goes down that route, then aspects of what I include in structural discrimination should maybe not be included there. So that is something for me to think about. These are certainly good points. I do not see much by way of primitive accumulation in these two villages. I did in the 90s. There were strong attempts by Thakur to take over land from the Jatas by way of excluding them from access to irrigation and so on. But now that is not the case any longer. Instead, they lease out their land to them. So there's a different kind of relationship that have been established. So what I see here is standard capitalism when it comes to the agricultural relations. The Jats and the Thakurs have got access to all sorts of illicit and criminal ways of accumulating, but in relation to agriculture, that doesn't seem to be the way they organize their exploitation. The point by Ravi, yes, indeed, the difference, and apologies for not dealing with all the questions. I simply can't keep them in my head, all of them. So I deal with them that I can actually see how I can deal with. So apologies for that. Ravi's point about the Jatas being compared to other caste groups elsewhere that must be in a much worse position since they come to UP to work. That is of course true, and that is in a sense part of why to me the Dalit as a political category, I totally understand why it is there and why it is something Dalits would want to pursue. That unity gives, I think, as an academic analyzing, one has to point out the differences as well, not to reach sort of a classification where we sort of split all Dalit castes according to castes, but to accept that just as there are economic differences within castes, there are also economic differences between castes, and that it's a complex picture. So that one has to understand when one look at data on Dalits or Dalits or the data on SC because it will differ so much from both where and which groups one is talking about. So I think that's all I can offer by way of answers here for now. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jens. Thanks for dealing with as much as you could, and that was still quite a wide range of things. So I think we have time for just a couple of more questions. So I think Jan wanted to come again, and then okay, that's one question there. Jan, please, and if you could unmute yourself. It just needs to unmute.
Jan, we don't hear you. Jan, we don't hear you.
You need to unmute.
Can I make a point of order?
Yes, please.
Please go ahead. Go ahead, Jan.
Okay. It's interesting that what Shapan said, that Hindutva is considered to have joined within the Hindutva fold, in the Hindu fold, as a matter of fact, which was straightly denied by Jens when he said, no, they are not part of the Hindutva bandwagon. They have distanced themselves from them. And here is interesting, is this story of the Dalits being in the Hindutva fold. Is it the propaganda of RSS? Or is it also acknowledged by the Thakur in the villages, which Jens has investigated? My assumption is that the Thakurs will be with Hindutva. And do they accept the Dalits as Hindus? In other words, is the contest about caste class more at the local level than at the central level?
Thank you. Thanks, Jan. And there was just one final question.
I'll cut short my. I had two questions, but I'll only ask one.
Yes, thank you.
So I had two questions. One is about the political, but that is all debated. So I'll stick on to the methodological question. That is like I was wondering about the relevance of the place studies in the context of fluid geography of oppression and discrimination, and like why you are not considering critical agrarian studies as a kind of disciplinary goal for understanding these oppressive lines. Thank you.
Sorry, so your question is.
I'm asking about the methodological question about the what is the relevance of the village studies when there is kind of fluid geography of discrimination and oppression.
Why village?
Beyond village. Yeah.
Why village?
Yeah, and please.
So just a quick two-finger to that. In some sense, would you say that your findings support what political scientists have also said about Dalits in Hindutva, that at least that they have had a very sophisticated caste, if you like, analysis, which targets the non-Jatav Dalits and the non-Yadav OBCs, for example, in UP. So if a study focuses on Jatavs, you wouldn't necessarily find the BJ, you wouldn't find Hindutva, but you would if you were to look at the other Dalit subcastes. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. And if I somehow expressed that the Hindutva movement or bandwagon is not trying to include Dalits as part of that, I've misspoken. I've meant to make the connection from the Arya Samaj and up till today, and saying that the agenda really is the same, of including Dalits in an inferior position within the alliance. And what's so interesting for me to see is how the Jatavs simply do not accept that. And this is the position of Jatavs is well known from opinion polls, from research papers, that there is the one big group among Dalits in North India that resist Hindutva. So it is unsurprising that is what I find as well. The one person that does support Hindutva and BJP is the ex-Pradhan, that of course was voted in as Pradhan with the votes of the Jats and made a killing in that position. So that is just a footnote. Now, do Thakurs see Dalits as Hindus, I haven't asked the question directly, but yes, they do, in the sense that they're part of the rituals. They have the inferior part of the rituals. They are which they now do not want to carry out anymore. But that sort of signifies that they are part of the pantheon, just at the very lowly level. So they do. The Thakurs are also very happy that the BJP is in power again. The one joke I heard from a lawyer that came back on his motorbike from Lucknow when I sat in an air-cooled house of one of the Thakurs was because this was not long after the election. Yeah, great. Now we can rape the Dalits again, and it was a joke, I assume, but it expressed that of course they're happy for Hindutva being in charge, and of course they know the power that relates to the government being on their side and can't be used by the others. So methodology in place. Well, one thing that I thought of presenting here today, but I didn't, was a discussion of class, a more deep discussion of how to analyze class. In the end, I gave up because to me, it is problematic that agrarian studies stick to land and agrarian exploitation as defining what class is, and then non-agricultural jobs is an add-on. And one needs to have a class understanding of non-agricultural jobs as well. And you could probably see I was going in that direction there. But to make the clear cutoff point, when does this lead to expanded reproduction, and when is it just reproducing as a commodity producers level? Those call I just didn't feel totally comfortable of throwing out there yet. I need to think more about that, but that in a sense is also about place, because that and of course these go back to early discussions, and can you have what is a class in societies where there are economies that are functioning at different levels in a sense. So very interesting, but I have not dared to go there yet. I will go there.
Okay, great. So on that very interesting note, I think we should all come together and thank Jens for this tour tip over. Thanks to everyone who joined us here, and thanks to everybody who was online with us all this while. Just to say that our next seminar is on the 23rd of March. It's on Syrian refugees as agricultural laborers in Turkey, reflections on refugee-host relations from a labor perspective. So I hope we'll see many of you there as well. Thanks so much.